So our next guest is the amazing Dr. Bruce Watson. I love saying that because it's such a, I don't know, a humbling thing for me to see Bruce here coming in from the Netherlands to share his thoughts, wearing the orange royalty colors of the Netherlands. Bruce, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Bruce. I just need to say a couple of things. So, Bruce and I met on a little bit of a NATO gig a little while ago, and we were both dealing with a project under DMCCI at the time, or MNCD2 under DMCCI, which is a multinational cyber defense project. And Bruce had this amazing correlation model that he has in his head. I have no idea how he puts it all in his head. He's got a lot in his head. I don't think there is a technology environment that Bruce hasn't touched. Everything, like I think he was just mentioning it. Chip design, writing code specifically for compilers. He's written operating systems. He's worked for all kinds of companies that let him share. It's just, I am humbled by his experience, and even more so how he still talks to me. So, Bruce, thank you very much, and
thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be back again this year. In fact, it's a real honor to be back. It means that I either over-explained things last year, or it made absolutely no sense, and Neil decided to invite me back to explain something different. Yeah, it's actually a very nice introduction. I think, quite honestly, I've just had a string of incredible luck. So being able to work on programming languages, chip design, various network security appliances. So it's a string of lucky breaks for me, and I think personally, if I look around the room, pretty much all of the people that I've met would certainly be in a position to have done exactly the same kind of thing with exactly the same breaks. So anyway, this time around, it's a pleasure to not just be talking about the deep details, as I did last year, of advanced persistent threats and deep panda and so on, but this time I'm going to be talking about cyber war. And a quick overview of this talk. I'll skip to the cartoon at least so you can sort of muse that one a little bit. I realize, of course, that I'm the guy standing between you and the next coffee break, so there's fantastic coffee, there's food, as we've heard from Neil, as we've been doing so far. And this talk is going to be more about raising questions or raising awareness of what cyber warfare is about. And I think once we get to some of the more philosophical questions, you're going to look at it and you're going to say, well, that seems self-evident. It's the kind of stuff that I've worked on before. That's no big deal, Bruce. So the intention really is to convey a bit of the wow factor, but also a number of these things that are dramatically different in cyber and in terms of cyber warfare that mean that the landscape is changing, the techniques for defense, how we would actually run this kind of thing is dramatically different from how we would have normally run warfare, which we call kinetic warfare. So normal warfare involves hitting things, blowing up things, and so on. And cyber warfare is, of course, the opposite of that. So anyway, this cartoon is from a handful of years ago. This actually came out just a year and a half after the first real cyber war, which was against Estonia, widely thought to have been by the Russians. In fact, that's more or less undisputed, except by the Russians. Anyway, this cartoon came out at the time, and people were musing about what does it mean to beef up our soldiers? What are they going to look like in the future? Do they get even bigger? Do we arm them to the teeth, and so on? And the reality, of course, is it's the guy in the background, the puny nerd like me, that's sitting there at the keyboard and hopefully doing good and dramatic things in terms of defense, and potentially in terms of offense, depending on which country we're talking about. So if we skip into a little bit of the history underlying this, and just talk briefly about how we actually even got there. This is a page out of the engineering logbook for the first network packets that were sent. So this is back when I was a toddler, and I think there are people in the room that weren't even born at that time, and most people don't remember this actually having happened, unless you actually worked at ARPA at the time. So this began as a military project, and packet switch networks were really designed to be robust against all kinds of things, most of all nuclear war or other things that took down part of the network. So the first packets were sent, and of course then we had a long period of, a lot of nothing happening, which is really where people got to experience this as a way of FTPing things, fetching big files, sending email. But the World Wide Web didn't exist. Eventually, 25 years later, we came up with secure ways of communicating between sites. ways of doing things like web banking. That took off now at least 20 years ago, so that's the good news. It's been in play for quite a while. And then people started to talk about, well, I wonder what's going to happen if we could actually conduct warfare in this sphere, which is when things become a lot more tricky. So as people started to talk about that, a number of people started to think about what the implications are in terms of normal warfare. You know, does it make sense to just randomly do this? Can we actually extend the rules of war as we understand them and map that down into cyberspace? So something came out called the Talon Manual. I'll mention again on the next slide. But the Talon Manual came out as a direct result of that cyber attack on Estonia, which was very important. A handful of academics, at the time current military people, former military people got together and co-authored this. And it turned out to be an extremely important book. It was developed physically in many ways at the NATO Center for Cybersecurity in Tallinn in Estonia. But it's not an actual NATO manual, so it's of course supported by NATO, but it's an open piece of literature, and many other countries use this as the foundation for that. So just this year, the second edition has been released, and that indicates that there's a lot of motion where a lot of things are in play in cyberspace and in cyber warfare, which is, on the one sense, you could say encouraging, but it also means that it's become a bit more of a scary environment. So if we take a brief look at what the Talon Manual itself is, as I said, this is just a book that was put together. Almost 24 co-authors of the book, all experts in their field, either warfare or technical experts in cyber, which makes it very important. And they came up with, in the first edition, came up with a handful of these so-called black letter rules, which are really the rules, the generally accepted rules of warfare. And these are the rules that they all agreed on, and of course with each of these rules there's a bit of rationale, so each of them had slightly different understandings of these things, and they elaborated on their understanding, and that basically is what makes up the bulk of the book. So what exactly does it cover? Well, it covers things ranging from how this interacts with humanitarian law, which kinds of things are you allowed to attack, but even before that it interacts with the notion of when are you allowed to actually conduct a cyber war. So this is the motivation for conducting a war. That might be there already, but there's the justification, the legal justification for conducting a war. And then there's the question of, well, does this actually make sense in cyber as well? And then lastly, of course, in the new version, things have grown dramatically, as I said. So this was the reason that a new edition has come out. And in fact, it's remarkably difficult to get a hold of the new edition. It's sold out immediately. And of course, you can get bits and pieces online, and the NATO Center of Excellence provides a lot of this material as well. So anyway, let's take a bit of a digression right now and have a look at what I even mean by cyber warfare. So on the map there, in fact, there are a couple of slides surrounding this. We already know that we have land as an area for warfare. We have sea as an area for warfare. We of course have the air above, and we have the all-encompassing cyber, which is a subpart of all of these domains. Whoops. Now we've done it.
Button, Mike.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So there is a slightly different way of viewing this, and in fact I'll revisit this on the next slides as well. Because if we take a look historically at warfare, there's of course the notion of land warfare, so simply traveling across land, taking care of conducting warfare in that space. Eventually, and I'm talking now thousands of years ago, people developed boats, and boats were no longer simply a way of getting to another piece of land to conduct warfare. You could actually conduct warfare at sea as well. And a couple of hundred years ago, people decided, well, if we can be on the sea, we might as well be under the sea as well. So submariners arose as a way of conducting, first of all, transportation to conduct a war, and then as a way of conducting warfare under the sea as well. And it's maybe a bit of self-evidence there, but it goes without saying that eventually we moved to having war in the air, so this wasn't just transporting us from one place to another. And we of course then had war in space as well, which we haven't conducted, and we've all agreed that this is not a place that we want to conduct war, but space is still used as a transportation mechanism to get from here to there, in terms of ballistic missiles, for example. And then where does cyber fit into this? Well, cyber is, of course, all-encompassing on all of this, and you could say that cyber is interwoven with all of these things. So not only are our fighting machines and our defensive mechanisms deeply interwoven with cyber, but cyber itself is another dimension in which we could be conducting this kind of thing. So let me spend a handful of slides now just zipping through some of the things that, as I said at the beginning, I think you would consider these to be relatively self-evident things. And simply pointing them out because I think most people that come from a normal kinetic warfare background are not necessarily thinking about how radically different these things are and why we need different structures for thinking about cyber warfare, or cyber in general, as I said. So the first thing is to consider the incredible breadth of impact that cyber and cyber war can have on us. We of course can view things in a purely digital fashion. So what does it mean to have cyber warfare in a digital fashion? Well, there's of course, let's say the consumption of computational resources. So this would be flooding your network, using your web servers, overloading your web servers. There's the destruction of data. There's the theft of data. There's of course the blocking of various online services. So these are some of the techniques that were directly used in the attack on Estonia. So those are the traditional ways that we think of cyber warfare, as long as it stays in the purely digital domain. And then you can ask yourself, well, what are the things that cause this? Well, we can have rudimentary things that cause this, so ways of flooding a network using botnets. We've got malware, some malicious pieces of software that actually travel to somewhere and do some destruction, or actually are part of a larger scheme for stealing data from somewhere else. So these are the mechanisms that underlie the breadth of cyber warfare. And I think most people would say, well, you know, all that stuff's not that big a deal, but it really gets scary once it actually emerges into the real world. So that's the bottom part of that mind map. When there's a cyber attack and it actually starts to have real life effects. So for example, effects on telecommunication infrastructure, of course, smart cities, so all of our traffic flow, utilities, electricity, and of course broader things then. So now that we have largely automated vehicles, aircraft and so on, the attacks on that kind of thing become significant. So okay, that sets the landscape for the breadth of what I would view as being potential cyber problems. Now if we take a look or enumerate a number of the ways that this differs dramatically from our normal everyday experience in life, you know, there's a handful of fancy words at the top there. So this is basically what I call the collapse of the model-object dichotomy. And that's a $10 way of saying that we normally exist in real life in terms of having plans for things and actual objects. So on the left panel there, you can see the plans for an FN rifle. Many of us will remember. And at the bottom, you have an actual FN rifle. And having the plans is not the same as actually having a real rifle. So you can go to a typical public library, you can find the designs for nuclear weapons, you can find the formulae for ricin and sarin gas and so on. But having access to those plans doesn't mean that you can actually go and build one. So there's a significant barrier to entry between getting the plans and actually engineering it out. In terms of a rifle nowadays, if you've got a good metal machine shop, you could probably produce it, but quite frankly, it's easy to just go to Liège in Belgium and buy one with a license, and away you go. So the separation between plans and real life things is critically important for how we conduct normal life in the normal economy, shall we say. So things change dramatically once we move to the e-economy or the cyber economy, and of course in terms of cyber warfare as well. Because now the plan is the object. So I'm cutting a few corners here. Software people in the room will know that I'm cutting corners because of course the design for the software isn't always the same as the software. But broadly, these two things are much closer than ever before. So once you've actually got the design for the software, you effectively have the software as well. And this means that there's a completely different barrier to entry. There are things that you can get much more easily. As soon as you get the design, if you're a rogue nation, you effectively have the weapon. So you get the design for the FN rifle. That doesn't mean you're going to shoot anyone unless you sort of smack them with the paper for the blueprint. So we get into a situation that Escher did this painting or this drawing actually in the bottom right corner. We get into a situation where we need to actually view these things very differently, especially in terms of proliferation. So blocking people having access to designs is now actually important, whereas we don't really care if the North Koreans or whoever goes to a public library in Canada and goes and looks up the design for a nuclear weapon. You know, we know that's not the critical barrier for them actually doing something with that. So proliferation becomes one of the issues, and of course that has trickle-down effect. You can now have cyber mercenaries who can very easily get a hold of the design of cyber weapons and then right away put them into action, which is not something that we could do with normal blueprints at least. Lastly, it has the effect that disarmament is almost impossible. So unless you have to find a way, like Men in Black, of just flashing people's retinas and erasing what's in there, you know, once they know how to build these things, or once they have it on a flash disk or a memory stick, away they go. Whereas normal blockades, embargoes, sanctions, disarmament are ways of preventing other people from getting the weapons, and of course taking away the weapons is something that you can traditionally do. So the next thing that more or less follows from that is free replication. So we can replicate weapons at zero cost. So if you take a look at the bottom left panel there, this is during World War II. Apparently the photos from Australia. And of course it costs tremendous amounts of money and manpower, women power in this case, to actually produce weapons. You need raw materials, you need a factory, you need to keep the factory cranking. Once you've shot all of your weapons, you actually need to make sure that the factory is producing more. And of course, in battle, like the Israelis discovered a few decades ago, you can actually almost run out of artillery and other shells, and you need to go back into production very urgently. So this becomes a critical difference with cyber warfare, where we can actually duplicate these things infinitely, and basically at zero cost to actually duplicate them. So it means that the cost of rearmament, once you've taken away their weapons, the cost of rearmament, as I said on the previous slide, is essentially zero as well. And this has a relationship to what we normally view as piracy, people stealing music, stealing movies, and so on. But there, there are a lot of legal frameworks for blocking piracy, and we're just going to sue them to death if we're from the movie industry. But in terms of weapons, you're not really going to go sue them to death as well. And then lastly, one of the other things that can happen with cyber weapons is, of course, replication on the fly. So actually, as you fire a cyber weapon, you have the ability for this thing to be replicated as it's actually traveling towards you, which is totally different from standard kinetic weapons, which are basically traveling as a single piece, or as a shotgun, but that's more or less built into the design of the weapon as well. So that becomes crucially important as well. Let's see, what else can we talk about? There's the issue that the speed of light becomes a major factor. So weapons are traveling at the speed of light, and that means that we've got a few fairly self-evident things that we can say there. One of them is that the traditional notions of radar or early warning systems don't work. So the way radar works, as I think most people in the room will know, is bouncing a radio signal, microwave signal, off the incoming object. So it can be an incoming missile or an artillery shell or even a bullet. And as long as you've got powerful enough radar at the right wavelength, you bounce it off there, you get the signal back. And of course, your radar is effectively traveling at the speed of light. Not quite true for the electrical engineers and the physicists in the room, but basically the speed of light. And that's much, much faster than the incoming bullet. So the incoming bullet might be traveling at 3,000 meters per second, 3 kilometers per second, and you're dealing with radar that's traveling at 300,000 kilometers per second. So 100,000 times faster, 5 orders of magnitude. Means that these kinds of things are viable. But if the incoming cyber weapon is effectively traveling at the speed of light as well, well, you have no real hope for having a radar. So not all hope is lost. I mean, I don't want to be depressed in this whole thing, but it means that you actually need various other forms of detection and ways of slowing down traffic, which is typically not what we want to do, certainly in people's lives where they're designing data centers. That's the opposite of what you're trying to do. But that kind of infrastructure for getting a grip on early warning is, of course, important. And even if the weapon has arrived, it's still instructive to actually know that it's arrived and to know what the damage assessment should be and what the mitigation should be after the fact. There is one piece of good news, and that is these weapons have zero mass. So in bullets, we traditionally make bullets out of depleted uranium or lead or steel or things along those lines, copper. And we certainly don't make bullets out of feathers. So if you fire a feather bullet at someone, they're probably going to, with a normal shirt, no matter how big the load is, they're probably just going to have no problem repelling that bullet without a bulletproof vest. And the same thing goes for cyber weapons. You don't need heavy armor because these things have zero mass. You need smart armor and smart infrastructure for defending against these things. So a completely different way of viewing things. Now, one of the other weird factors that we have in play is, of course, our traditional notions of the topology of the universe also completely disappear. So traditionally, we'd see a theater of operation or the weapons having to travel through our normal three-dimensional space. And here I chose a particular example. There's a flight time. You can barely see the red line there, but that's from Pyongyang to Ottawa. And it's a predictable flight time. If someone launches something in Pyongyang and it's flying towards Ottawa, we know roughly how long it's going to take before it gets here. We know the trajectory it's going to take. That ties in with our radar comment from before. And of course, if you live somewhere else, like the Netherlands, in my case, you know that a problem between North Korea and Canada is not going to unfold into a problem for Europe because you're completely out of the theater of operation. So you've got a notion of it's all happening somewhere else, where it's at least isolated there, or it's predictably over there, and we can stay out of that. And that kind of thing is simply not true in terms of cyber warfare. So the right panel here is a picture actually out of a physics blog, where we have wormholes in the universe. So we don't have an actual wormhole that's been detected yet, but wormholes in the universe are basically foldings of the universe and shortcuts then in the topology of the universe. And this would allow us to have completely different travel time by traveling down a wormhole and coming out somewhere else, which is way faster than taking the long route where you wind up at the same point in the end, but much, much further. So in terms of cyber warfare, the topology of cyberspace is a many million, if not billion dimensional object. And a cyber war that's being conducted between two European countries, or between an East European country and one in the West, that kind of thing can have a spillover effect because of this topology directly onto Canada. And the flight time of those cyber weapons to Canada is roughly the same as getting to the West European country. So our normal understanding about who's connected to what is no longer true, and our ability to hide or at least stay out of the theater of operation is completely untrue as well. Then the last thing that I want to point out that's radically different is, of course, the notion that we can hybridize weapons. So if you attempt to hybridize weapons in real life, you get a couple of weird ones. The left panel there is one that was really built, in fact, reasonably successfully by the Russians. So it's effectively an aircraft, but it's intended to fly really low, so it's kind of effectively a boat, but then it's made out of lighter materials. So it's intended to fly in ground effect, and it looks like a kind of chimeral cross between an aircraft and a boat. And that's something that you can successfully build, but it takes huge engineering effort to take those two concepts and actually glue the concepts together and have something that works. The right panel there, the upper right panel at least, is a gun. It looks like it's designed to shoot lasers and a grenade launcher, and it's got a bayonet and the whole shebang. So it's actually what presumably some teenage science fiction maniac dreamt up as being a hybridized weapon. Now in cyberspace, we can actually do these things relatively easily. So there isn't huge engineering effort to taking two different cyber weapons and hybridizing them. And in fact, it gets even worse. We can actually automate this hybridization process. So there's a whole field of genetic algorithms where we can hybridize two algorithms. This is a very well understood area of computer science. We can hybridize two algorithms, and we can then test their fitness. And we, of course, introduce some mutations as well. And if we do this for enough generations, we'll eventually breed an algorithm or a handful of algorithms, in our case a cyber weapon, which is then better than the sum of its parts. So ways of hybridizing, mutating, and coming up with something better is something that we can do just the way farmers and plant scientists do with various strains of rice and corn and so on. So we can proceed in exactly the same fashion, and we can automate that whole process. So we can set up a candidate network or a candidate computer system, hybridize attempts to attack this, and come up with entirely new weapons in a completely automated way. So now, if you weren't scared before of all the other weird stuff, this is the one that probably should scare all of us, because this is something that actually also has quite a low barrier to entry, and there are enough toolkits out there that a typical teenager would be able to put that into action. So I'm roughly halfway through the slides. I'm going to speed up now because I just also want to point out some of the really critical things that arise as we look at cyber warfare, cyberspace. And this also connects back to some of the legal things, which I think are tremendously important. And of course, being a relatively peaceful country here in Canada, much of Europe as well, we have less to worry about from what we develop in terms of offensive weapons than we do perhaps in terms of having good defenses, or in terms of what a potential rogue nation might do. So I'm going to stick here very specifically when I talk about cyber warfare to nation states. And of course, all of these things project down to corporations and individuals and so on. So it's important to connect the dots there as well. To a large extent, I would say, sorry, let me quickly put all of these up there. I would say that we are, in a sense, in a situation where cyber is a battlefield. It's a domain of war. It's not always understood that way. So you could say this is cyber crime. You could say, well, it's slightly worse than cyber crime. Let's call it cyber terrorism. And of course, you could take it a step beyond that and call it cyber war. But we right away have an immediate question where if all of these things are going on all the time, which is actually the fact anyway, then are we not constantly at war? And if we are constantly at war, is there something that we should be doing about it? Should we be having a kinetic response against whoever's conducting the warfare against us? Should we be using atomic weapons? Should we be using biological weapons, chemical weapons? And of course the last one, the digital attack domain, or the cyber war domain. And then of course, if you're going to go down that route, do we want to attack nation states? Do we actually even know which nation state has conducted some offensive attack against us? So attribution is one of the key factors. And what happens if we actually go and accidentally hit civilian infrastructure? So these things are now so deeply interwoven that it's almost impossible to go and hit a purely military installation without having some collateral damage. And of course, you can even accidentally hit a third country. And as I said, this is because of the topology of cyberspace in general, but it's also because we're using a lot of the same infrastructure. So there's Windows everywhere, there's a ton of Linux, FreeBSD, lots of Macintoshes, and attacking a particular country, if you're doing this with a broad spectrum weapon, has a real risk that you're going to end up attacking a handful of other countries as well. So I'll talk about that very briefly at the end as well. So I think the message, and I'll revisit this again at the end, but the message is that we have a real question about whether we have the appropriate infrastructure for this kind of thing. So a handful of other things do come into play. I think one of the most important ones that I want to mention briefly here before moving on is the issue of cyber espionage. So espionage is generally accepted as something that happens in peacetime. It's actually also part of confidence building. There's a certain allowability to your potential opponents knowing what you're up to. And that sort of keeps the peace in a sense. But cyber espionage is in some ways a little bit different. Very often it has a commercial component to it. There's actually no risk for those conducting the cyber espionage. Very often they're actually not in place or not even in the country against which cyber espionage is being conducted. So there's literally no risk to them, at least, being outside that country, outside that domain at least. So do we accept this? Do we use force against cyber espionage? There's a real question there. And of course it ties in with something that I consider probably a very interesting humanitarian issue. And that is, for as long as warfare has been around, or certainly as long as landmines and sea mines have been around, we've had the question about whether the planter of the landmine bears responsibility many years down the road for the fact that this was planted. And of course, this is part of why we have the comprehensive ban against landmines, of which most countries at least are signatories. And this prevents us from having a longer-term effect in terms of warfare, even when people have come to a peaceful conclusion, and having landmines that have to be scraped out of the ground in countries like Mozambique and Laos and so on. So we have exactly the same thing in terms of cyber. The planting of cyber weapons during espionage operations or during cyber warfare operations. It doesn't always mean that they'll be easy to remove afterwards. And in fact, typically if they're well designed, they'll be something that will sit there very silently and might actually pop up as a form of ransomware. And of course then you have a real liability question there after as well. So let me move on to a couple of notable cyber attacks. So I mentioned this one already. This is the government of Estonia. In fact, it went a bit broader than the government of Estonia, but also hit many of the banks there. So very, very digital society, e-society and smart city and so on. And this is a very rudimentary attack attributed to the Russians. Not so clear whether it was people in Russia, so these so-called patriotic hackers, I think they've been called recently. Or people that have direct sponsorship from the government, so that's a rather amusing distinction. A couple of years after that, there were two other cyber wars. One of them actually was against Georgia. This was conducted, most of us think, by the Russians. And I mean Georgia in South Ossetia, so bordering on Russia. And it's easy to see why that was conducted as well. There was the cyber attack on the Iranian centrifuges, and of course attributed to a couple of countries who you can imagine would like to damage these centrifuges. So that was much more specific. There was this attack on Saudi Aramco, which has potential attribution also to one of the neighboring countries, or nearby countries at least. and that damaged a lot of data, locked up their ability to do business over quite some time before they recovered their data centers. And then finally, one of the more recent prominent ones is this one in Ukraine, and this fairly clearly ties to the East Ukraine and Crimean situation, and this affected the distribution of power and a couple of other utilities. So these are sort of the most notable ones, and we have to ask ourselves, if these things are conducted, what is the typical casualty rate in this kind of thing? So it's fair to say that if we take a look at this, the only one that's likely to have had any casualties would have been this most recent one, and especially if it took down power to hospitals and so on. So there's potential that had some casualties. But all of the other ones, there's no evidence that there were any real casualties. And so the question then comes, well, can we justify using kinetic weapons? And if we do justify using kinetic weapons to actually retaliate or deal with this, do we do it in terms of let's say, conventional kinetic weapons? And it's fair to say that if you take a look at these two weapons, the one on the right is this miniaturized nuclear weapon, but this has the same yield or the same destructive power as the mother of all bombs, and which is a traditional weapon. And of course, no one's going to authorize the use of a nuclear weapon when there's been some sort of attack. At least very few people will authorize that, and this is sort of viewed as the holdback. And we need to view cyber more or less in the same way. Does it actually make sense to drop the mother of all bombs on someone's data center just because they're conducting cyber operations against you or cyber attacks on you? And how bad does it have to get before we can justify doing that? So one of the terms in the original word cloud that Neil had at the beginning of the morning was, of course, cyber hygiene. And I think certainly people running or operating or building data centers at least need to ponder for themselves exactly how well they're taking care of their cyber hygiene, and whether negligence in that regard, in terms of cyber potential for cyber attacks, is of course something that yields blame on you as the operator, or can we always say, well, the offending party or the attacker is of course always the one to blame and then subject to retaliation. So I think there are some interesting legal questions that arise there. So is cyber a domain of war, or is cyber a battlefield? I basically say yes. I think that's my conclusion, not only from the preceding round of justification to you at least, but I think most people would agree that this is either a current or soon to be potential domain of war. But we have huge amounts of problems. So we have issues with really handling all of the politics surrounding that, the legal justification for this, knowing what level of response is actually justifiable. So this is something that's codified in the law of conducting war. And of course, there's all of the public perception surrounding that. So the last two slides, before I take any questions, and of course people dive for the coffee break, the last two slides they are readable. I want to briefly mention the issue of how we can evaluate our maturity, so that our capability maturity model, if you will, for cyber warfare, but of course you can apply this to many other fields, and on the next slide I'll briefly mention it for cyber warfare. So there's a knowledge management or a knowledge evolution model that we use in a certain area of research. So one of the things that Neil didn't mention is that I have 2 academic affiliations as well. So we write a bit about this, and you may have seen this before. It's the progression of knowledge from an art to a craft, to a discipline, to a science, to an engineering. And I think pretty much everything that humankind has come up with has progressed through this. And if we start with the art, and I don't mean literally fine art, although that's a perfectly good example, but if we start with the art level of things, then you typically have a brilliant person who's come up with a way of doing something, and they'll do it as a bunch of one-offs, but it's not reproducible. So even if you go back to the same artist, they're not always able to reproduce this accurately. If they do a really good job, it costs an absolute fortune. If they do a really bad job, it's dirt cheap, but of course the quality is really low. So in terms of, at the art level, we have a very high band between earning power at the top, earning power at the bottom, quality level, low quality level, reproducibility is bad, and so on. And of course, once the artist dies, it's completely gone. So then we move on to a craft, which is typically where we'll have a master and an apprentice. And the master is someone who apprenticed themselves, presumably at the feet of an artist sometime before. And this is then passed down by example or by long hours of learning. And by that point, we actually tighten up the reproducibility of things, the cost of things, and you have a certain school which has a very good master and people that learn there as well. And then eventually people say, well, look, this is not really a good way of economically doing this. Let's actually move on to making this a discipline. So people actually start codifying or writing down the rules of thumb, which are the ways of doing this. And if we take a look, for example, at building data centers, to randomly choose an example, 50, 60 years ago, this would have absolutely been an art. So you've got people that do it badly, people that do it properly. And that was more or less, with enshrined in that particular data center designer. That was then passed down to the master and apprentice, and you go to a particular company or a particular organization to have that done. And of course, if you go to the wrong organization, well, you get a bad data center. And then by the time it reaches the discipline factor, there people have actually got their standard way of working, their rules of thumb, and this is the discipline of that particular company. Then things move on to being a science, where people take a look at these rules of thumb and say, well, why don't we actually figure out why these rules of thumb work, why the rules of thumb from that organization work better than from this organization, and we get an underlying science behind this, which allows us to move on to an engineering discipline where things are codified in an engineering code of conduct, best practices, and there's tremendous reproducibility. Of course, the salary band is then narrowed, so you don't have many poor engineers, but you don't have any massively Picasso-rich engineers either. But it is reproducible, so if you have a qualified engineer. So how does this map onto the cybersecurity world? There we can see my interpretation of where things are right now. So the advanced persistent threats, which are what I talked about last year and have been floating around for quite a few years, are still in the art domain. You really need some kind of maniacal computer super genius who's going to cook up that kind of thing, or a small group of them at least. And they may or may not be working for governments or corporations, but that's really very much an art. At the craft level, we have CERTs, so these are the computer emergency response teams. And the certs I put at a craft level because there's a lot of master and apprentice thinking that goes on there. You've got the super genius who works funny hours of the day and he passes on his wisdom to anyone who will pitch up and is willing to learn and do things his way or her way. And cyber weapon construction actually also fits into that category. So the reason certs and so on are still at the craft level is if we take a look at the cyber war on Georgia, they had to call upon the Estonians to bring in a few people and teach them how to do it. So that was a typical master's and apprentice construction. Discipline, this is then hacking. So hacking is no longer an art. You can download all kinds of rules of thumb, or lots of books, of course, are purchasable on hacking. So anyone can hack. And they just need to follow the rules of thumb. And of course, practical cyber hardening also follow from rules of thumb. So there are all of these standard guidelines that you can obtain for how to harden your systems. The science is really computer science. So we've known for many years how to build hardened systems. We just aren't willing to spend the money to build hardened systems, or we've got so much legacy. And of course, only kinetic warfare is really at the engineering level. So cyber warfare is nowhere near being at the engineering level, but we know how to build artillery, fighter aircraft, warships, and submarines. So with that, I would like to close that off and of course take any potential questions. Thanks.
Bruce, thank you. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Pleasure.
This topic is really exciting to me. Bruce and I were in Estonia, 2 weeks ago? Yep. And had an amazing amount of discussion on this thing, late nights, lots of shots, provoking thought. I think, it just came out of sitting around in the elevator one day. We just sat down and just regurgitated a whole bunch of stuff, and Bruce was amazing at just developing within 30 minutes he came back and said, I've got a list of all this stuff and organized it. I'm already just overwhelmed with all this and I don't even know how so Bruce, thank you very much for delivering such an amazing presentation on the concept of, thank you, cyber as a domain of war, or cyber as a battlefield. So I'm sure there's piles of questions. I'm sure there is, because I have lots, but please let me open the field and I'm going to pass the microphones around.
I should mention I'm here all day as well, so in the event questions pop up later, I'm happy to discuss.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. One of the attack vectors, of course, is taking advantage of flawed software code. OEMs, many of them might claim that their code, to a large degree, is more secure than open source. What's your view on open source versus, OEM code from a security standpoint?
Okay, that's a particularly good, if slightly loaded question. Look, I've got a lot of sympathy for both sides. The standard mantra of the open source community is that by going open source, you provide access to all of the source code. People can rummage through it, people can fix errors very quickly, fix potential security flaws very quickly as well. And of course, more eyes are a very functional way of doing that. I happen to have worked at Microsoft, and I'm talking about a long time ago when Microsoft was a small company. And at the time we were very closed source. In fact, there wasn't really an open source community to speak of. So I do think that all the large proprietary software vendors also recognize that the open source community is winning in that regard. That said, there's a crucial flaw with the open source community, and that is the gatekeepers of new software updates is typically a very small group of people. So if you look at Linux, there's Linus Torvalds himself, and then of course an inner circle of people that are respected by Linus, but also by the rest of the community. But there isn't really a strict vetting process for who joins that inner community. You can have someone that eventually isn't a particularly good coder, or actually has some rogue motivations themselves anyway. And this is one of the reasons that I've personally gone for using various kinds of hybrid systems. I happen to use FreeBSD over Linux, simply because the operating systems researchers working on FreeBSD tend to be people that are highly specialized. These aren't people that come home from their day job and happen to work a bit on the Linux kernel. They actually know all of the guts of this kind of thing. So I tend a bit more towards a hybridized solution. And of course, the large companies, the Microsofts and the Oracles and the IBMs, Hewlett-Packard and so on, I think they have certainly hope of actually keeping and getting this under control, perhaps even by releasing some of their source code. But the smaller software vendors, there's almost no hope of getting completely on top of hardening their product, sadly.
Good question. Any others? Come on.
Yeah, hi Bruce. It seems to me that there seems to be a closing of the gap between sort of the cyber and the kinetic. And you are more and more able to actually affect real world sort of effects and consequences from the attacks. So just wanted to get your view on that closing of the gap, and if you see at some point that the distinction between the two either is going to go away or at least mutate from what it is now.
So I really enjoy that line of thinking as well, because this is also one of the things that I think drives a lot of military doctrine. So people do take cyber defense and cyber warfare seriously, but people don't want to throw tons of money at it or have very active defenses until something emerges into the real world. So how do you emerge into the real world? Well, of course, now that we have automated vehicles, or you look at some smart cities where the control of traffic lights is something that's highly automated as well. That kind of thing, the emergence of a cyber attack into disrupting traffic or causing accidents or causing failures at hospitals will eventually lead to deaths. And I think that's, of course, the point at which people will say, well, now we've actually fused cyber warfare with kinetic warfare, and people have actually died as a result, and now we can take appropriate action. So I certainly think that's the trajectory that we're on. That said, there will be an entirely different trajectory to cyber warfare, and it's actually back in some of the very early slides that I presented here, but the notion that there's tremendous damage that can happen purely in cyber. So of course it's only economic damage, and we could say, well, do we really care about that? But this can be really serious economic damage. It can cripple banking systems. It can, of course, cripple privacy, hacking of records, obtaining of records. And you can, in a virtual sense, you can certainly ruin people's lives doing that. So I think even before we get to the point where things emerge into the real world and we can take kinetic action, I think there's an appropriate justification for really paying attention to the purely cyber threats that then don't necessarily kill people, but cause the economic damage.
Civil unrest as well.
Right. Yeah, that's actually an interesting crossover as well. So the Estonians are pretty chilled people, and they didn't throw their toys out of the cot when they couldn't bank online. But now that we scan our own groceries, and if that halts for 7 days, and you can't fill a prescription at a pharmacy, and you can't get through the traffic light, sooner or later someone's going to start putting the baseball bats through the windows and so on.
Well, I'm sure everyone's dying to get something in their stomach and eat, and I'll let you ask your questions outside. Bruce, as I'm sure one of your many email addresses from one of the many universities that you participate with, you'll be inclined to share. And please do hit him up because he is a brilliant mind. I am humbled by the fact that I have a potential to write a paper with this gentleman here, and hopefully we can present it at the next SciCon and in the US, and we look forward to that on this topic. It's super exciting and really poses a question of negligence on our part to protect ourselves versus the concept of cyber espionage, which is socially accepted at the state level, versus cyber attacking. The concept of causing mass destruction. And are you really killing people with cyber attacks or cyber espionage, if I may separate those two? And if you're not, are you justified with an attack in a kinetic sense? It's so exciting. It's kind of new ground, and laws aren't really catching up to it right now. So Bruce, thank you very much. One word of note for you guys. There's a Concept Espresso is going to stick around for a little bit more. I've asked him to stay. I love their coffee, it's great. The gentleman out there, and what is his name, he roasts his coffee beans 3 times a week. They're fresh. And Sean, I think you can attest to this. Sean and I frequent a place downtown whereby they purchase the beans from him, roasted, and I don't know what it is. It's a whole different taste from the dishwater that we're used to. But I've asked him to stick around in case you want some specialty coffees. Please do partake in that. It's a lot of fun. Try something different and give it a go. He's got all kinds of different milks and waters, and he's self-contained. So yeah, Concept Espresso. Anyway, go outside. Hopefully, I'm not sure if they're going to have lunch ready per se, but we're supposed to have 2 more sessions. One with Paul Butcher. Paul, did you bail on us? I think he's outside. Paul's going to talk about the cloud and the concept of the crown in the cloud, and it's more of a financial impact on that, how best to benefit from a procurement of the cloud services, and the challenge that maybe the crown may face. I'm not saying certainly, but may face based on their procurement models, and we see that in the triple P conversations of fixed price versus those models that we've described, and long-term gain. How can the crown possibly benefit from this, and why some companies just say forget it? I'm not bidding on that because it doesn't make any business sense. So Paul is coming up, and then worst case, I have to deliver the emissions. Folks from CSE, where are you there, Pat? You said. They said, well, the attribution's too close and they can't deliver it, but it's my research anyway, so I'll be doing that and it'll be quick. And then we'll get right into Andy's fabulous, heartfelt story about his life living in Fort McMurray's fires, and probably teach us a lot about, certainly teach us a lot about his experience. His experience will teach us a lot about disaster management and the concept of planning. All right, so take a few minutes and then I'll call Paul in and we'll wrap that session up. In worst case, I'll launch the emissions stuff just before Andy. Give it a few minutes and then we'll come back at 1 o'clock. Thank you.